In a statement read out to the Workington court, the victim, Miss Moretta, said, "I just thought he was going to ask me directions, so I put my head in towards his vehicle as I couldn't see properly because the sun was glaring off the windscreen. The passenger side window was missing or wound right down, and the quarter light window was shattered. At this point I looked at the man. He looked at me with such a blank expression on his face. He never said a word to me. Then I saw him with his left hand just lift from his handbrake area a gun. He pointed it at my face and I just pulled back and turned to run. I then felt this almighty thump. It was like I had been hit really hard in my face. I then just ran off holding my face, screaming and waving my arms down the road." We get no physical description of the gunman, but again, the witness says such a blank expression on his face. Location 20, Sims Travel, 11:50 a.m. 0 dead, 0 injured, 1 witness. Mr. Preston said, "He shot the rifle at us and we were in total shock because you don't expect it. We didn't know where the bullet might have gone. The taxi then drove away." Location 21, Dalegarth Station, 11:53 a.m. 0 dead, 0 injured, 1 witness. Christine Alty survived another execution attempt after being beckoned over to Bird's car. The shot missed her, but she remembers a sudden loud bang and a whoosh of air past her face. Location 22, Holland's Campsite, 11:55 a.m. 0 dead, 1 injured, 1 witness. At 11:55 a.m, Nathan Jones and Philip Moore were leaving the Holland's Campsite with a dog. Bird shot Jones in the face and he had a .22 bullet lodged in his right cheek, but survived. Location 23, after Holland's Campsite, 11:57 a.m. 0 dead, 1 injured, 6 witnesses. At 11:57 a.m, Samantha Christie and her boyfriend, Craig Ross, pulled over so she could take a photograph. As Bird drove by, he asked, "Are you having a nice day?" Before she could reply, he opened fire, inflicting multiple injuries to her jaw, palate and eye socket. Mr. Ross began running to her aid, but stopped when Bird ordered him to get back into the couple's car and drive away. As he did so, the killer fired a parting shot and shattered his rear screen. Motorist Carlton Watts, who had his wing mirror clipped by the taxi, described Bird as driving like a crazy person. He added, "His eyes were bulging and he was fixated, and I thought, this guy is a nutter, I'm going to get out of here." Location 24, Doctors Bridge, noon. 1 dead, which was Derrick Bird, 0 injured, and 2 or 3 witnesses. We come now to the final scene, which raises yet more questions. The Telegraph newspaper reported, Jonathan Wilkinson was with his girlfriend and parents in the isolated village of Boot in Cumbria when Bird's silver Citroen Picasso shot past him, denting the side of his car. Furious with the driver, Mr. Wilkinson chased him, determined to note down his registration plate details. However, when he caught up with the car, the driver had vanished. Bird had abandoned the vehicle and set off on foot before killing himself in nearby woodland last Wednesday. Mr. Wilkinson, 30, had no idea that the man he was following had just killed 12 people and injured 11 others on a 3-hour rampage across the country. "I thought he was a hit-and-run driver, and I thought I should get down the registration plate and his details," he told The Sun. "He was about 160 yards ahead of me. The car was weaving all over the place, and because one tyre had gone, he was driving on the rim." Mr. Wilkinson started taking photographs of the vehicle before he noticed that the front windows had been smashed in and there were rifle cartridges on the front seat. "The first photographs I took were of the back of the car and the license plate. As I made my way to the front, I saw a hole in the window and live bullets scattered across part of the dashboard and in the footwell of the car. When I saw those, the survival instinct kicked in and I just started running back as fast as I could. Now I think I must have been the last person to see him alive." There are 2 more witnesses to the gunman abandoning the vehicle, but these other witnesses do not mention seeing Jonathan Wilkinson, and Jonathan Wilkinson does not mention seeing them. The other witnesses were Zoe and Lee Turner, who it is alleged were the last people to see Bird alive and were featured in a very detailed article in Mail Online. The article states, "Staring straight ahead, vacant and glassy-eyed, Cumbrian killer Derrick Bird stood in the quiet country lane with a large .22 hunting rifle held across his body in both hands. By his side was his damaged car, its front tyre shredded, passenger window shattered by gunfire and empty cartridge shells littering the floor." Facing him and frozen with fear, Zoe Turner took in the incongruous scene in the idyllic Lake District Valley, and thought only of her 2 sons playing yards away. Looking her straight in the eye, the man who minutes earlier had shot his final victim in the face, seemingly at random, appeared to make his decision. But when Bird spoke just 3 words, it was to offer her reassurance. "You're all right," he muttered, gruff and emotionless, before walking off, crossing a stone humpbacked bridge over a small stream and disappearing. This article doesn't say that Zoe and Lee Turner saw a man taking photographs of the vehicle. Now, I don't have time to read this very long article, which features an image of the gunman's vehicle with what looks like a taxi sign on top of it. I telephoned Lee Turner and spoke to him on the phone and asked him about what he witnessed. He described the gunman as being very red in the face, short, overweight and balding. I asked him when the photographs in the article were taken. He then went online to look at the Mail Online article in order to answer that question. He stated that this photograph was taken about a minute before the gunman crashed his car, but couldn't remember when this one was taken. He said, it can't have been taken that day because I've got different clothes on, and said it was probably taken on that holiday, but he couldn't remember when. I got the impression that it may have been taken specifically for this news article, but perhaps he didn't want to admit that to me. He also said the official time of the gunman crashing his car at 12:01 he knew to be incorrect because of what he knows to be true. I asked Lee Turner if he could remember a taxi sign on top of the vehicle. He replied no, but that where a taxi sign would be, there were bits of yellow tape. No previous witness has mentioned there being bits of yellow tape on the roof of the car. This article looks like an attempt by mainstream media to dot the I's and cross the T's for the public. It's all over now, nothing more to see, get on with your lives. Let's just discuss some of what happened.
There does seem to be some discrepancies between this idea of him being in essentially a psychopathic rage gone postal, or for want of a better expression. The concept that, again, it's a kind of a Hollywood thing of this person that's so furious and so driven that he's just going to do this until such time that the red mist clears, which seems completely separate from the descriptions of him being incredibly calm. He doesn't appear to be acting in a frenzy. He's quite calm in the manner in which he pulls people over to the car and such like that. The mainstream story seems to be 2 types of killer, which would be a spree killer and somebody that's got a specific point, like a vendetta type killer. Mm-hmm. And I don't think those 2 are the same, and I don't know as the actions that would create that are the same. There are some discrepancies that would suggest to me that perhaps you've got a scenario where you've got multiple shooters and actually multiple cars as well. It would seem that perhaps a couple of these cars are perhaps similar in order to cause that confusion.
The first murder, for which there were no witnesses, was that of Derrick Bird's twin brother and took place around 5 a.m. This was followed by a 5-hour gap before the remaining 11 murders occurred, taking place more or less consecutively between 10:13 a.m. and finishing at around 11:30 a.m. I am not aware of any hard evidence that Derrick Bird perpetrated the first murder, that of his own brother.
A week previous, David and his brother Derrick were up at the local scramble track with an off-road vehicle that David had just finished making. And they spent quite a bit of time that afternoon driving round and round, laughing their heads off, like you would expect warm brothers to do.
And I would ask, what could be the reason for a 5-hour gap between the first 2 murders? Is it possible this time period was used to turn Derrick Bird into a patsy using the techniques described by Neil Sanders?
One of the first things that Alan Dulles said when he was starting the MK Ultra program was, we want to find the conditions whereby we can take somebody off and in the space of, say, half an hour, we can hypnotise them or cause some sort of thing which would make them, say, crash a plane or crash a car.
Family puts no blame on Derrick. They knew Derrick for 52 years. There was a new Derrick for a few hours of last Wednesday, and the 2 things were very separate in the minds and memories of the family.
I mean, how controllable this person would be as an entity, whether you would require another shooter, I don't know. It very much depends. There are psychotronic weapons that can put voices into people's heads and essentially turn people schizophrenic. Again, whilst that might give you a result. I don't know how controllable that would be as a sort of murder tool.
I've highlighted some anomalies which suggest that more than just Derrick Bird may have been involved in what happened. I've also shown witness statements which suggest that Bird may have been under some kind of mind control. However, I don't want to use guesswork to come up with a scenario on what may have really happened, because I still don't have enough evidence to create a hypothesis. Simply to say, there are enough holes in this evidence to warrant reopening this case and an external new team re-interviewing all the witnesses to find out what really happened. The Thornhill events are particularly puzzling, and I'd be interested to know if anyone has suggestions for a scenario that fits all the evidence. If this was a conspiracy with operatives involved, one has to consider that the senior police investigating officer and the coroner could be involved to some degree, even if it was just making sure the outcome of the inquest matched what had already been put out in mainstream media. It's a safe bet they are both senior Freemasons. An inquest is different to a trial in that we do not have a lawyer defending Derrick Bird. All the evidence put before the jury is decided by the coroner and not put forward by a defence lawyer. Therefore, any evidence which contradicts an official line could in theory be left out by the coroner. There would be no one to challenge this if it happened. What I am saying is an inquest is much easier to fix than a trial. I would ask the question, was Derrick Bird murdered, in order to ensure this would be run as an inquest and not as a trial, and also to silence the PATSY. At this stage it is pertinent also to point some things out I noticed about the inquest. We have a case involving 12 murders and 11 serious injuries at 24 crime scenes. Throughout the entire inquest, one senior officer, Detective Superintendent Andy Slattery, gave testimony on all the incidents. Although some junior police officers did give statements on individual incidents, Slattery was clearly the voice presenting the views of Cumbria Police, covering the whole case, giving evidence for every single incident. It appears that most of the information coming from the police to the inquest was being handled by Slattery. Between Coroner Roberts and Detective Superintendent Slattery, it would have been quite straightforward for them to manipulate the verdict of the inquest by ensuring the jury did not see any evidence which contradicts the official story. I am not saying this is what happened, just exploring it as a possibility. Out of the 90 or so first-hand witnesses, less than 30 attended the inquest in person. The vast majority of witnesses received a letter saying they would not be required to attend and their statements would be read out. Having looked at some of the evidence I've so far been able to uncover, it's not clear to me what happened that day, and it seems possible that people other than Derrick Bird may have been involved in these murders. Let's now come on to the issue of motives. To establish a motive, one needs to know what happened, how it happened, and who was responsible. In other words, we need to know who the true perpetrator or perpetrators were. There are two clear scenarios to consider. One, the perpetrator was Derrick Bird acting alone. And scenario two, those responsible were persons other than Derrick Bird, and Derrick Bird was a PATSY. If we first go down scenario one, that Derrick Bird was solely responsible, there are a number of possible motives that have been put forward, mainly by mainstream media, as the reason for his drastic actions. In fact, the sheer number of motives put forward by the media suggest that no single strong motive exists. Here is a list of the suggested motives I have learned about, largely put out by mainstream media. I will state also that I don't know if they are all true. 1. Derrick Bird fell in love with a woman from Thailand 3 years previous and sent her £1,000. She then asked him not to contact him anymore and he was upset over this. 2. Derrick Bird was in a dispute over his father's will because of money given to his twin brother. Derrick Bird's father died in 1998. That's a long time to wait before getting upset. 3. In 1990, he resigned from his job at Sellafield because he was facing disciplinary proceedings over allegations that he stole some wood. Even longer time to wait before getting upset. 4. Derrick Bird was in debt. This is untrue. He had savings of £22,000. 5. Derrick Bird had avoided paying tax. This is also untrue. He was on a low income and claiming tax credits, therefore was not liable for income tax. 6. Derrick Bird was being investigated for tax evasion. This is untrue. He had just completed a bog standard tax credits check, which he passed. The Inland Revenue then requested a bog standard tax inspection, which was in the process of being carried out. He was not subject to any criminal investigation or prosecution by the Inland Revenue. 7. Derrick Bird had been involved in disputes with other taxi drivers over queue jumping at the rank. 8. Derrick Bird had a minor scuffle while out drinking in Whitehaven. 9. Darren Rocastle threw some milk in the boot of Derrick Bird's car. 10. Other taxi drivers were jealous of Derrick Bird because he was self-employed, and so on and so on and so on. I will also mention here Detective Chief Superintendent Ian Goulding, who at the inquest in his statements spouted a great deal of what sounded like unsubstantiated hearsay concerning Derrick Bird's frame of mind.
My officers and I are absolutely determined to get to the bottom of why this happened. However, it may not be possible to establish all the answers because we cannot speak to Derrick Bird.
He is alleged to have said that Bird arranged a meeting with Kevin Commons to discuss his finances. He said that Bird had been worried for some time about his involvement with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs over tax payments, and he had developed irrational fears of prison. The fears were made worse by the belief that his brother and solicitor were conspiring against him. Now, Goulding would not have been allowed to say these words at a trial, but because this was an inquest where a coroner can admit hearsay evidence, he was allowed to say them. Just consider this. The comments by Goulding are about Derrick Bird, who is dead, Kevin Commons, who is dead, and David Bird, who is dead. How the hell would Goulding know all this when all three people he is referring to are dead? It seems to me that Goulding took advantage of the fact that dead men can't talk, and took advantage of the fact that hearsay is permitted at an inquest. What an utter disgrace that Goulding was actually allowed to spout these words without a single shred of proof. To my knowledge, there is no evidence of any of these claims other than Bird arranging a meeting with Kevin Commons, who was a family friend. The media, of course, just spouted Goulding's hearsay as if it were gospel. None of the motives put forward are likely to have caused a peaceful, quiet man with no history of violence to go and murder 12 people in cold blood. People say it was a combination of these factors which pushed him over the edge. If you really believe that, I suggest you have been watching too much television. Now let's look at scenario 2. If the real perpetrator was not Derrick Bird, then the motive cannot be established by looking at Derrick Bird or looking at the life of Derrick Bird. It can only be established by looking at the victims and asking the question, could there have been a strong motive, probably by a powerful group or person, to murder at least one of the victims on Derrick Bird's hit list? It took me about 10 minutes, and I didn't have to look very far to discover a very strong motive to murder Derrick Bird's second victim, solicitor Kevin Commons, which will take a little bit of explaining. 6 months before the Cumbria massacre, West Cumbria suffered severe flooding, which damaged hundreds of properties and caused one death. The flooding was caused because Thirlmere Reservoir overflowed due to heavy rainfall. But we need to go back to 2005 to explain this story fully. This internet article points out that in 2005 both Keswick and Cockermouth were flooded because when the above average rainfall filled Thirlmere to overflowing, the excess water turned the River Greeter into a raging torrent. Apparently, in 2005, United Utilities, which owns Thirlmere Reservoir, was first asked to lower the water level during the autumn so that there was additional capacity to hold the winter rains coming off the Lake District fells. The private company refused to do so, claiming that its priority was to keep the reservoir full to the brim so that it could provide the necessary water to meet the needs of 300,000 homes in Greater Manchester. But in November 2009, heavy rainfall caused Thirlmere to overflow yet again. The result this time was that not only were Keswick and Cockermouth flooded again, but also the main north side bridge in Workington was swept away and PC Bill Barker lost his life, preventing a major disaster by stopping cars from crossing the bridge. Again, prior to the disaster, Thirlmere Reservoir was full to the brim. This time, to make the problem worse, work was being carried out on the Manchester Aqueduct, restricting the amount of water making its way down to the city, which meant the reservoir was overflowing even before the heavy rains of November the 19th. If the water level in Thirlmere had been 3 metres below the reservoir wall, as was called for back in 2005, then this disaster wouldn't have happened because the abnormal rainfall would have been easily absorbed. There is no doubt that the high water level in Thirlmere was responsible for the devastation caused in Workington and Cockermouth. Now, Kevin Commons, who was the boss of Kevin Commons Solicitors, was in the process of trying to sue United Utilities for causing the floods. This was a massive legal case, potentially worth millions of pounds, and as mentioned, it involved the death of a police officer. This news article explains that Kevin Commons contacted 150 people affected by the floods. It states all are interested in joining a mass legal action for compensation. This is a letter I have obtained written by Kevin Commons Solicitors to United Utilities, pointing out the possibility that United Utilities could be to blame and inviting United Utilities to make a pre-action disclosure, asking them for flood prevention plans, reports and recommendations made to the company by supervising engineers, maintenance records, water level records, and information about when pumps were switched on and off, etc., etc. I spoke about this in 2014. Suffice to say that if Kevin Commons' action had been successful, perhaps the directors of United Utilities would have ended up in prison. This hypothesis becomes more interesting when one realises that the two most senior executives at United Utilities both resigned around the time of the Cumbrian shootings. The legal action was taken over by Marcus Nixon. Marcus Nixon was investigated for fraud in 2013, and eventually the legal action was dropped. So imagine what might have happened to United Utilities and their bosses if Kevin Commons had not been murdered by Derrick Bird. In my opinion, this seems a far more likely motive for murder than the ones attributed to Derrick Bird. And in saying this, I am not accusing anyone at United Utilities.
How well respected was Kevin Commons in the community?
Oh, enormously. I mean, Kevin used to be a court clerk here in Workington and decided to set up his own business 23 or 24 years ago, I think it is now, and started from scratch and built it into a very big and successful business. And he was a very much larger-than-life figure. And it's difficult to believe that, you know, a man of his stature, both in physical terms but also in his reputation terms, is no longer with us.
I suppose it's a sign of his commitment to his profession that he didn't retire.
Yes, it is. I mean, Kevin turned 60 towards the end of last year, a time when people think about retirement, but he very much was somebody who cared passionately about the criminal justice system and working as a defence advocate for all those years. He wanted to carry on doing that, and did right up until the day of his death.
Have you any sense yet whether Kevin Commons was a particular target for this killing?
I've no information I could give about that, because that would be subject to the police investigation.
Perhaps by murdering 11 more people instead of just the one target might have been done to hide the real motive and hide the real target.
History of American serial killers, where it would appear that one or two were hits, say political assassinations for example, and they are disguised by putting them into the milieu of this is a random set of killings and such like that. So in theory you could suggest that maybe like the lawyer or perhaps any of the witnesses could have had some sort of other explanation behind it that we don't know about.
This might seem unbelievably ruthless and beyond comprehension for some of you, but I can assure you there are people in this world capable of such acts and much worse. Perhaps Derrick Bird's reason for meeting with Kevin Commons was not to discuss his finances, but perhaps to discuss flood damage compensation. Derrick Bird's 83-year-old mother lived in one of the villages that was affected by the floods. Before we wrap up, let's just make a few observations about mainstream media and their coverage of the events that day. The The first the police knew of the shootings was at 13 minutes past 10 by a phone call from Susan Rooney. At 11 a.m. the police posted a message on their public website reporting on shots being fired by a man in Whitehaven. Not until 2 p.m. did police report on their website that they were apprehending a man near Boot in Cumbria. BBC Look North, who normally broadcast their programmes from a studio in Newcastle, 100 miles away and a 2.25-hour drive from where the events took place, decided to present and broadcast their entire early evening news programme live from Whitehaven. In order to get camera crews and newscasters to Whitehaven ready to go on air by 5:30 p.m, the staff, who would have been expecting to be working from the studio in Newcastle, must have been told very soon they were to get over to Whitehaven to film the show there. So somebody at the BBC made this decision very early. I would ask, does this show some kind of pre-knowledge of what was going to happen that day? And once they started their broadcast, the case was closed from word go. Within just a few hours of the murders of 12 people, spread over a massive area of countryside, our media had it all wrapped up. A lone madman, acting independently of anyone else, had gone on the rampage with guns. End of story. The only question to be asked by them was, why would a man do this? Jumping straight to the motive before they've examined any evidence of what may or may not have happened. Putting into the public's mind a narrative before any real investigation had taken place. In addition to this disgraceful journalism, just listen to the tone of the presenters' voices and their attitudes in these clips. Carol Malia is almost gloating to the camera, possibly because she knows this is a chance to shine on national TV.
That he had taken his own life. Well, our chief reporter, Chris Stewart, has been following events. All day here in Whitehaven. Chris, just give us a sense of some of the terror that must have been occurring here today.
It's been an extraordinary and a dreadful day. We were here, we were probably the first television crew here, and when we got here it was very odd because we were right next to the scene where the man was found dead this morning. At that time we were told one person had been killed. That very quickly became two. The police didn't confirm anything, and then we got to Prime Minister's questions time, and David Cameron said 5 people had been killed. Now, at that time, I'd actually been told that the figure was more than 5, and sadly, that figure turned out to be correct. 12 people dead, and the gunman as well.
This is Whitehaven. Things like this just don't happen here. It really is such a shock.
With the police closing in, he shot himself in these woods in the tiny beauty spot of Boot.
I hope I have illustrated that police investigations and our justice system need to be more transparent. My wish is for this case to be reopened and reinvestigated by somebody other than Cumbria Police and the Coroner's Office. This investigation should re-interview all the witnesses and also publish all the CCTV evidence which has been hidden. I will leave you with the words of taxi driver and victim Paul Wilson, whose comments, if taken literally, may well just be true.
The guy that shot me, the guy that's done these 12 murders and his own suicide, the guy who's injured all these people, the guy who's basically just dramatically changed his community, isn't the guy that I know, isn't the friend that I know, isn't the colleague that I know.